We have lined up 2 brown bag sessions that are confirmed. The dates and the titles are not confirmed, but they're with Prentice Research Affiliates. Brenda Leung, who does research on alternative health protocols, is going to give a brown bag in the winter. They call it spring here, but January is not spring. So I call it winter, but it's going to be in the January term anyway. Maybe this year January will be spring. You never know. So she's going to give a talk on the brown bag series in the January term, and James Graham will also give a talk. He's in new media and does some really innovative work on virtual reality. So he will be giving a talk as well, and apparently he's going to have a demonstration thing so that people can play with it. So that should be quite fun. We also have a very special event, which I'm very pleased, at the initiative of Jeff Bingley, who's our cameraman, who just finished his master's degree, on December 7th, which is a Wednesday, and it'll be in this room. It's going to be at Prentice Brown Bay. December 7th this year is the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And why is that important? It's important because that event started the internment of Japanese Canadians in camps not too far from here in the Kootenays. So we have invited George Takashima, who does tours of the camps and speaks a lot with Japanese Canadians about their experience in the war. We're going to have him come and talk about that on the December 7th, which is the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The reason why this is so compelling, of course, is because we might be back to that again with a different group that's labeled as, you know, to be registered. There's already discussion about registering of Muslims in the U.S. by the new Trump administration, so who knows? But the fact is that it's useful, I think, to talk about this history. So that'll be a nice special event, I think, on December 7th, noontime here. Hopefully we'll get a number of people. So that said, let me have the pleasure of introducing John Ziker, who is professor and chair of the Department of Anthropology at Boise State University. And John is a Fulbright Scholar here at the University of Lethbridge for this term. So we're delighted to have him come and speak. I'll just say a little bit more about his history in a moment, but let me just say that I met with him in early October, and I hadn't frankly known that much about his work, so I was delighted to find out that in fact his work and my work are real close. Different countries, but he does work in global population, life course, economy, which is what I do, in a different context and everything, but still is a remarkable parallel. So when I heard about all this and read some of his work, because I've read quite a bit of it now, which is fun, I said, quick, we got to get you to do a brown bag talk in the Prentice Institute, and he very nicely said, sure, let's do it. So here we are. So his long-term research in Siberia connects economic factors and economic downturns with demographic behaviors, essentially. And his current work here is in the Research Data Center, working with the National Longitudinal Survey of Children and Youth, which I've also worked with. So it's fun to have these commonalities and to discover them, so I'm delighted. So I've already said he's in the Department of Anthropology at Boise State University, chair of there. Did a PhD in anthropology from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and works with Siberian indigenous people since 1992 on topics of land use, property, food procurement and distribution, kinship, and demographics. Dr. Ziker takes a human behavioral ecology approach to human problems and is applying this body of theory to issues of family health, another thing we do in the Prentice and I do. In fact, I was in Minneapolis week before last giving a keynote address, and he was in Minneapolis just a couple of days ago giving a talk. So this is amazing. Different things, but still, same town. Remarkable. Anyway, his research is featured in the journal Science, Human Nature, Human Ecology, Nomadic Peoples, Sustainable Science. I could go on and on. He's the author of Peoples of the Tundra, Northern Siberians in Post-Communist Transition in 2002, and is now, as I mentioned, a Fulbright Scholar with the Palix Foundation, distinguishing visiting chair in brain science, child, family health, and wellness here at the University of Lethbridge. So we're delighted that he would come and talk with us, and I look forward very much to your talk, as we all do.
Thank you, Susan. That was fantastic. Well, I'm really happy to be here and to give this talk, and happy to be associated with the Prentice Institute. As Susan mentioned, I'm have long-term field work in Siberia, and so the Fulbright is really a neat opportunity to try and do something completely different, related in some ways, but on a topic that is of importance to a broad sector of society, and bringing in some of the insights that I've discovered throughout my career in anthropology. So with my work in Siberia, I've looked at a few things that have that you could think about in terms of intergenerational transmission, one of them being property. I did a lot of early work on transmission of property. And another thing I've done a lot of work on is kinship, and how kinship and descent affect behavior, and how those properties are transmitted across generation. So here I'm focusing on stress and how stress affects development and health outcomes. And I think this work falls under the general category of the developmental causes of health and disease, which is a big rubric that the medical community is interested in, the neuroscience community, and social scientists. Here, focusing on childhood conditions, social wealth factors, and how they are impacting life cycle development and reproduction. So just a few shots of my work in Siberia and kind of the work I've done there. The groups I've worked with are the Dolgan and the Naganasan. And then the community is Ustavam. I've done some work in some other areas, but I spent most of my time here. They've experienced drastic economic changes after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And this has led to a lot of economic changes, but it's also led to settlement pattern changes, people being drawn into the villages and spending more time in the villages throughout the year rather than being out in the tundra and producing food for the Soviet planned economy. So this has had other sorts of effects, such as binge drinking. So not only did people lose their jobs after the breakup of the Soviet Union and were stuck in the village, but which was an incredible demoralization, but then the alcohol marketing industry became privatized in Russia, and private traders began coming to these villages and selling alcohol, vodka, to the native people at 10 times the price that they bought it in the cities. This led to, in combination with the fact that people received their money, social welfare payments or whatnot, very irregularly when helicopters would come to the community. This led to a lot of binge drinking and high rates of unnatural deaths in the community. This more high mortality rates and high rates of unnatural death were paired with a drastic decline in fertility rates. And this is the subject of a recent paper and another one that I'm working on, looking at that fertility transition. They went from approximately 5 children per woman before 1993 to just over 1 child per woman in the 1990s, and that's continued into the 2000s. As a result, the fertility rate's barely outpacing the mortality rate. So the kids of that generation that experienced the breakup of the Soviet Union, there are a lot of bachelors in the community. In addition to that, more recently, there have been these cases of serial suicides in the community. So the stress of the breakup of the Soviet Union is continuing on to the next generation. And I know that these kinds of phenomena are occurring not only in Russia, but all across the circumpolar north, including northern Canada. So another thing that got me interested in this topic was the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, where in the preface of Volume 5, they mentioned that it wasn't only the survivors that suffered, but it was also their children and grandchildren, their families and extended communities. So there was, again, this perpetuation of the stress effect. And this was not only relative to abuse, but also to mental health issues and imprisonment. So I think this research has application, beyond, it has application for the Indigenous First Nations of Canada, but it has implications for the population at large. This is, I'd say, kind of an extreme case. And the Siberian research is an extreme case. There's a lot of interest in the developmental causes of health and disease. This was an article that came out in the Huffington Post, which is kind of a popular media outlet, about research done at McMaster University on mice and how early life stress on these mice affected the gut microbes in the individuals, and then that led to all sorts of other problems, including immune diseases, depression, anxiety, chronic diseases. And this really, this even hit NPR, National Public Radio, and it's interesting that they've proposed this pathway of stress through the gut to depression. But I'd say I'm not advocating that particular pathway, but I think what has been fairly well established, more in the medical literature, is that early toxic stress affects multiple biological systems. And so we're not really advocating one particular pathway, but that we see effects on biological systems, on immune system, and on mental health as well, neuroendocrine systems. So the most popular way of looking at this, I think, and I see this in the neuroscience literature, I see this in a lot of the health literature, is what I'm calling a developmental constraints approach. And this approach really looks at early life conditions, and especially harsh early life conditions, including toxic stress, as directly affecting the development of the phenotype in a way that is somewhat divergent or somewhat in the direction of dysregulation. So harsh conditions are leading to what Peter Ellison called a pathology or constrained outcomes, might be another term that you could use there. I'd say an extreme case of this might be fetal alcohol syndrome. And then in literature, Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, the mill that had worked them down was the mill that grinds them old. So kind of foreshadowing a little bit of an alternative hypothesis here. But well, I think one thing that's common is that basically the idea is it's speeding up, that early life stress is speeding up the life cycle in some way or another. So what does evolutionary theory and an anthropologist that has been working, kind of coming from an evolutionary approach, have to contribute to the developmental causes of health and disease? Just to kind of kick that off, wanted to review Tinbergen's principles, and these are, so Nico Tinbergen was a Dutch ethologist who developed this framework as part of his program in studying animal behavior, comparative animal behavior. And the example used in this article was that of a bird and a bird's song. I like using non-human examples to illustrate this because when we get to humans, it can be confusing a little bit. So the proximate approach, which I think is the approach, if we're looking at early life stress and effects on health and disease, is the approach that's most often taken in the neurosciences. And it's also common in psychology. Looking at the structure and the operation of the mechanism and So in the upper left there, you have the picture of the bird's brain and kind of the interconnection of all the neurotransmitters that produce the behavior. So that's the structure of the mechanism, or the structure of the trait that had been selected for. The ultimate explanation has to do with the evolutionary function or the utility of that trait. Why do birds sing songs? Well, it could be for territory, to announce, protect the territory. It could be to attract a mate. There's some alternative explanations right there. That's why the trait was selected for. And that's really the level of explanation that I'm looking at in terms of contributing to this idea of the developmental causes of health and disease. Ontogeny really is the development. Environment is really important. So in the lower left, you've got two sonograms, and one of them is of a bird that was reared in captivity, and one of them is a bird that was reared in the wild, and they're significantly different. So the environment has a lot to do with the calibration of the mechanism. So we're really interested in all different kinds of environmental conditions and how those affect development. Phylogeny has to do with the evolutionary history, how different species are related to one another, and how and when traits came about in evolution, and I'm not really going to touch on that for the rest of the talk, but those are the levels of explanation. So the research I'm doing this year with the National Longitudinal Survey of Children and Youth mirrors some other studies that have been done with other longitudinal studies, with longitudinal surveys. Daniel Nettle at the University of Newcastle has done work with the 1958 British cohort study and looked particularly at women and early psychosocial adversity and found that the women experienced health deterioration throughout their lifetime at greater rates than women who did not have early childhood adversity. And this was mediated by the immune system, and these women had higher levels of C-reactive protein in their blood. They had higher incidences of chronic diseases, but interestingly, how that affected their life cycle is really what the purpose of this article was. So basically, the fact that they had higher rates of diseases generally resulted in a higher rate of mortality. So higher rates of mortality, a lower longevity, a lower age, average lifespan. So how does the body react to that? Earlier menarche and earlier age of first birth. So there's some response that's happening later in the life cycle to the early life conditions that in some way is adaptive. If it's facilitating reproduction at an earlier age, then the chances are that the individual will reproduce or reproduce even to a greater extent than other individuals in the community. So what we're doing here is contrasting to some extent. This is a false dichotomy, but I'm going to, or it's a heuristic at least, the developmental constraints approach with the adaptive viewpoint, the adaptationist view that says that possibly some of the outcomes resulting from early life adversity could be adaptive in some way. Anthropologists and evolutionary psychologists aren't the only ones looking at this. Lauren Chabey in Physiology and Behavior just published a review article this year outlining 9 hypotheses that are based in evolutionary theory and biology, and how different ideas about how or models for the effect of early life stress on the organism. One of them is this adaptive response approach. She encourages a dialogue between the social science community and the medical community, and does suggest that in some cases, certain amounts of stress can actually have beneficial effects on cognition. And so she's not the only one, but this is a review article. There's some research indicating that certain amounts of stress actually can have beneficial effects. Frankenhuis, Panchinathan, and Nettle earlier this year looked at the environment. I mentioned environment before. All environments aren't the same. And I think this is something that maybe contrasts some of the field work approach that anthropologists tend to do with lab-based approach. And so considering the environmental conditions is really important. Two characteristics of the environment that they pointed out here are harshness and unpredictability. Harshness refers to rates of mortality and morbidity that are caused by factors not under individual control, but it's sort of a range of experiences that can be more or less predicted from observations in the environment. Whereas unpredictability refers to things outside individuals' control that are outside of this range of harshness. And what their argument is that where harshness is great and morbidity and mortality are high, this affects cognition. And it affects cognition in a way that moves the individual more to what they're referring to as a present orientation. Whereas in supportive conditions, individuals develop what they're calling future orientation. Present orientation includes characteristics such as impulsivity, future discounting, and vigilance. Future orientation is what in the neuroscience literature is referred to as executive function. And so they are suggesting that environmental conditions can help shape cognition in ways that are adaptive. Just in my own experience, my own research, I've also looked at harshness and unpredictability in terms of fertility decisions in Siberia and found that the responses, the drastic decline in fertility that we're seeing in Siberia, is probably not a reaction to harshness, but a reaction to unpredictability. Basically what's happening is with harshness, you might expect things like a lowering of the age of first birth, as I mentioned before. We're not really seeing that. What we're seeing is delaying having children. And then what's really causing the drastic decline in fertility is the cessation of having children. And the rates of women not having children has more than doubled. So going to the research project this semester at the National Longitudinal Survey of Children and Youth. This was a great study done by Statistics Canada that followed the development and well-being of children for 15 years. There were 8 cycles in the survey, so every other year they surveyed these children or their families. And it was specifically designed to look at the social, environmental, behavioral, material wealth conditions of these families and how these impacted the development of children over time. So it's a great data set to look at this kind of question. And a lot of people have looked at this, have looked at the National Longitudinal Survey for various questions, but they have not looked at it in terms of developmental constraints versus adaptive response. There were about 22,000 children in cycle 1. And this, I'm hoping that this research can complement other longitudinal studies that have been done, or analyses of longitudinal studies that have looked at similar kinds of questions like Daniel Nettles. So the research questions really are looking at, what are the maternal conditions, the stressors, the moderators of stressors, the social environment, so the wealth conditions, the neighborhood quality, et cetera, and how is this related to the development of any kinds of addictions and mental health disorders. I'm really interested in acute versus chronic stress. So something may have happened between cycle 1 and cycle 2, and then the situation got better. Or maybe these kids were under stress for several cycles. Was it a long period of stress? So does the timing of the stressor affect the development of addictions and mental health disorders? Again, risk and uncertainty or harshness and unpredictability in the environment, how do those affect development? And nicely, the National Longitudinal Survey has a neighborhood quality index, and they have other things that we're looking at in terms of unpredictability, such as changes in custody of the child. So if there was a death in the family or a divorce, if the kid moved from one parent to the other, those are certainly beyond the ability of the individual to control, and it's beyond the normal experience of the individual. Present versus future orientation and shifts also. I don't know if we'll be able to find any shifts, but we might. There are examples in other studies of shifts, so individuals coming from supportive environments, being exposed to a lot of stress, shifting to a present orientation. I think maybe PTSD might be an example of that for a lot of people. Can you go back if you're in a present-oriented state? What are the conditions that would lead you back to future orientation? All the factors that we're looking at, are they directly impacting the development of these conditions, or are there interaction effects? In particular, I'm interested in interaction of things like socioeconomic status and indigenous status. Are the outcomes developmental constraints, or are they adaptive responses? And then the final question, getting to the intergenerational transmission, are these kids setting up the next generation for exposure to another round of toxic stress through their own behaviors? So really what I'm suggesting is that there's a behavioral pathway to the intergenerational transmission of stress. At least we want to test to see if that is in effect, and we're going to be using proxies for early reproduction that we have in the National Longitudinal Survey. They also do ask about whether the individuals have had a child, but they're only 15, and then we may have a few, but probably not too many. From the anthropological literature, middle childhood is really important. There's been a lot of focus on early childhood. There's been a lot of focus on perinatal conditions, but we know that the calibration of the HPA axis continues on into middle childhood. And an example from Mark Flynn's work on the island of Dominica, he was he has 30 years of data looking at social relations, events occurring in that community, and how it affects the immune system, how it affects hormones. And here he has an example of a 7-year-old girl, I believe, that kind of going through her life in June. She gets reprimanded by her grandmother. The cortisol levels go up. The next day, the IgA levels, the immune system crashes, and then she gets sick after that. So what he's found after thousands and thousands of observations is that in conditions, in families where there's a lot of stress in middle childhood, this increases the morbidity rate and it increases the mortality rate. Why is middle childhood really important? Well, it's a unique characteristic of the human life cycle, where individuals are going beyond the family and learning how to relate in broader society. We have this long period of childhood and adolescence because it's a very complex social environment that we have to navigate, and so having that extended period helps facilitate that development. So I'm expecting that events in early childhood, either positive or negative, may have significant effects.
Sorry, what ages would you consider?
5 to 9, possibly yeah, it sort of depends on who you talk to. But other studies that have looked at environment and this predictive adaptive response hypothesis. This just came out in ProcV, a study of macaques in Thailand, and the authors were looking at the predictive adaptive response hypothesis and unpredictable environments. Why unpredictability is important is that if individuals are calibrating to, let's say, harsh environments, but harsh environments that are stable over time, then you may see some consistency in the response to that harsh environment. But if environments are unpredictable, then calibrating to that harsh environment, harsh and unpredictable environment, wouldn't make sense because the environment could change and become much better within that individual's lifetime. So what they focused on was this is an unpredictable environment, and unpredictable in terms of climate and food availability. Interesting thing about this species also is that they have social hierarchy. And we know that in primates with social hierarchies that individuals at the top of the hierarchy are generally in a better health condition. They have lower levels of stress hormones. Individuals at the lower end of the hierarchy have higher stress hormones, and they even have health problems resulting from that, including higher rates of cardiovascular disease. So this study looked at the feces of mothers and determined the glucocorticoid levels, and then also then looked at the offspring development. So they were looking at, and then they were also tracking changes in the environment. So they were looking at both internal and external stressors and the effects on the offspring. So from life history theory, the predictive adaptive response we would predict is that in harsh environments you tend to see this earlier reproduction, a general acceleration of the life cycle, and earlier reproduction. From the alternative hypothesis, you tend to see things like slower motor development. So again, the stable environments, I mentioned that. So what they found was that in terms of the growth and development of the offspring of stressed mothers, they found adaptive response. They found that these individuals were growing faster and they were bigger at 16 to 18 months. In terms of motor development, they found that the environmental stressors were slowing motor development. So what they found actually was a combination of the effects of internal and external stressors. The response to the external stressor was a developmental constraint. The response to the social stressor was an adaptive response, or in the direction of what we would predict from adaptive response hypothesis. So with humans, we also might see a mixture of adaptive responses and developmental constraints. So just to kind of summarize, the predictive adaptive response approach takes early life conditions and suggests that there may be an adaptive calibration to the adult state. If the adult state is developed under a lot of stress, we might see an adaptation to that state, which, as suggested by Nettle et al., is a present orientation in the psychology. Things like impulsivity, future discounting, vigilance. And I just typed, for the heck of it, put those terms, impulsivity, future discounting, and vigilance, into Google Images, and I came up with an anger management website and a psychiatry journal. So I think the implications of this are both for they're both clinical and basic research. With supportive environments, we would also expect reactive calibration, and that would be in the direction of future orientation or executive functioning, being able to prioritize goals, being thinking about the future. And just to that psychiatry journal I came up with did make an argument that impulsivity and executive functioning were polar opposites. They were antipodes. There was a study that came out earlier this year by Bielski and his group looking at the same question from a longitudinal study in the US. I wasn't aware that this one existed, but this study looked at age of menarche as the outcome variable, and harsh and unpredictable conditions. The measurements they used were not as detailed as the ones we're going to be able to look at. They used social economic status as a measure of harshness, which is somewhat questionable, but they did find an effect for infant-mother attachment. So supportive social environments in harsh environments did have an effect on age of menarche. So this bar graph on the right kind of summarizes the results. The two bars on the left are in supportive environments. They're in environments that are a standard deviation above the mean in terms of harshness. And you can see there that secure attachment and insecure attachment, the age of menarche of the girls is the same. But in harsh environments, on the right, the girls that had a secure attachment with their mother at the age of 15 months had an age of menarche that was, within statistical similarity to the girls living in supportive environments. But the girls that had insecure attachment at 15 months in harsh environments, their age of menarche was a whole year younger than the other girls. So the effects of harsh environment and insecure attachment is where you're seeing this adaptive response. And the way that the question is basically, does secure infant-mother attachment, does a supportive social environment buffer the individual from toxic stress? Well, there's some indication here that it does. What we don't know from this is, what were the parental conditions? How does this affect their own reproduction? And so we're hoping that with the National Longitudinal Survey, we can look at those kinds of questions. Can we link the parental behaviors to the offspring behaviors and the biological outcomes of the offspring? Regarding the pathways for transmission of stress in humans, there's a lot of debate. And this was a review article that came out in Neuropsychopharmacology Reviews earlier this year that kind of mentioned the three main approaches. Traditionally, there was basically a focus on genetics and the effect of stress on gametes. And the example they used here was for Holocaust survivors who had children after the Holocaust. The children appeared to be raised under they appeared to be affected by these highly stressful conditions, even though they weren't present in utero during the Holocaust. On the other side of the coin, you have the social learning approach, which basically says, well, it's learning. They're learning the behaviors. Genetics doesn't have much to do with it. And I'd say that everyone is moving towards an epigenetic approach, looking at development over a longer time frame, over the life cycle, and looking at both biological and social conditions and how that affects development. But a question raised in this article was whether supportive environments erase or otherwise prevent the effects of parental stress. This is an open question raised by this article. So I think that the research that we're doing here with the National Longitudinal Survey can help illuminate some of these questions. So in terms of the model that I'm testing for intergenerational transmission of stress, we've got, it's kind of based on this predictive adaptive response. Harsh conditions lead to a reactive calibration. the present orientation, leading to early reproduction, but also leading to things like that are risky behaviors, risk-taking behaviors. So part of that present orientation, the impulsivity, is risk-taking, including things like addictions and possibly some mental health outcomes that are related to early reproduction. Some of this has already been examined. Garrigo, who works for Statistics Canada, did find a relationship between the age at first use of alcohol and drugs and age at first intercourse. We don't know exactly if that it's a proxy for reproduction. They didn't look at other things like age of menarche, and again, they didn't connect that behavior to what the parents' conditions were. So the variables we're going to be looking at are a number of variables that we can use to represent harshness and unpredictability in the social environment. We're going to be looking at parental wealth, education, mental health, condition of the parents. We're going to be looking at some birth or around the time of birth conditions, pregnancy diabetes, low birth weight, early birth, twins, those kinds of things. Changes in custody, I mentioned that. And then the outcomes we're looking at are behaviors. There are a whole bunch of behaviors reported by the parent for the younger ages, and then behaviors reported by the child in the older ages. And then also looking at the variables that represent biological fitness. I mentioned those, sort of reproductive, the appearance of secondary sexual characteristics. This was something they asked about in the survey. Age of sexual experimentation, and they did ask about whether these kids had had any kids in the later cycles. So the statistical model is looking like this, or one of them. We're using two approaches. One is path modeling, looking at prenatal factors, toxic stresses at each of the time periods, factors that buffer stress, and then the outcome variables, the behaviors at time 1 and 2 and 3, and et cetera. The other approach is event history analysis. So we're going to be looking at the events, such as first use of alcohol, first intercourse, first birth, and what are all the variables that predict those events. This is an event history analysis I did on my research in Siberia. It's unrelated, but you can see here that the variable of hunter skill actually affects the age or the proportion of individuals, the proportion of men that have had a first child by any given age. So the better hunters here are having children. More of the better hunters are having children by the age of 35 than the mediocre hunters or the poor hunters, let's say. And that's probably because they are supporting their spouses. They're providing supportive conditions. And that question, that research, it's sort of a question of whether they're going to reproduce at all or not, as I mentioned. The relevance to health programs and policy. So we're hoping that insights from human behavioral ecology and life history theory, which are sort of the parts of evolutionary theory that I've been talking about, will help with understanding of the developmental causes of health and disease, considering the evolved sensitivities across the lifespan. In particular, the timing of stressors, the social moderators, and the environments. We also want to connect this to what are referred to as ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. This is something that in the social work community and in the neuroscience community, there's a lot of focus on ACEs. I think there's been a focus on the number of ACEs, and probably less of a focus on the timing of the ACEs. Also, we want to look at the SCEs, the supportive childhood experiences. So the hope here is that this research can help focus policies and programs to the most sensitive periods and conditions. And a few weeks ago, I gave a number of talks in Calgary and Edmonton to some practitioners and a group at Bow Valley College where the addictions, they have an addictions studies program there. And there were a lot of questions about the research and how it might be able to help them. And so the things that they're talking about or they're concerned about are protective factors, entry points for interventions, and how to get people enrolled in their program, how to get increased awareness and enrollment in their programs. So we're going to be looking at our results and trying to develop some findings relevant to those issues that are of concern to the community. So I'd like to thank my various affiliations and supporters and the Canadian Research Data Network, and so that's it.